community, awareness, and empowerment around issues affecting Muslims worldwide. Our program today is part of our Critical Issues in Context series, which delves into contentious issues affecting Muslim communities in both majority and minority contexts. We're very grateful to the Malcolm Nathan Fund for Social Justice for supporting this program and other events in the series. For 3 events, we have partnered with National Model OIC Pakistan. And for those of you who don't know, OIC stands for the Organization for Islamic Cooperation, which is an intergovernmental body made up of more than 50 Muslim majority states. And National Model OIC provides a forum for young professionals and future OIC leaders to engage in discussions that are of relevance to them. So turning to our event today, we are absolutely honored and delighted to have with us Mr. Mustafa Akyol, who is a celebrated writer and journalist, and who's also been at the forefront of advocating for a return of values in the Muslim world that once made the Islamic civilization a great one. So today, Mr. Akyol is going to talk about freedom of expression as one of those values that in the early Islamic centuries engendered rigorous theological and intellectual debates in the Muslim world. He will help us understand factors that led to its decline and also talk about the current space that is available for such discourse in Muslim majority countries today. We will introduce Mustafa fully in just a little bit, but I'm just going to quickly go over the format of our discussion. So we have 2 young professionals from National Model OIC, who I'm also going to introduce shortly, who will moderate today's discussion. So for the first 45 to 50 minutes, they're going to ask Mustafa a series of questions, after which we are going to open it up to audience Q&A. And we're going to request our audience to please submit your questions in the chat function and limit your comments to the please, if you could submit your questions to the Q&A function and limit your comments to the chat function, that would be really lovely. So now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our moderators for today's event, who have been instrumental in sort of formulating the questions and identifying the topic. So first up, we have Rutaba Tariq, who is the country coordinator for OIC's official youth forum and is also Asia's regional chairperson at the International Association for Political Science Students. Next, we have Asher Wilson, who is a leading advocate for institutional diversity and inclusion in Pakistan. He is the project director for Model OIC and is currently working with the UN Development Program in Pakistan. Without further ado, I'm going to now turn it over to Rutaba to please introduce our speaker.
Thank you for the introduction, Mehka. Mustafa Akyol is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute's Center for Global Liberty and Prosperity, where he focuses on the intersection of public policy, Islam, and modernity. Since 2013, he has been a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times, covering politics and religion in the Muslim world. He's the author of Reopening Muslim Minds, A Return to Reason, Freedom, and Tolerance, published this year, Islamic Jesus, How the King of the Jews Became a Prophet of the Muslims, and Islam Without Extremes, a Muslim case for liberty. His articles have appeared in a wide range of publications, including the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, among others. He has also appeared frequently on CNN, BBC, NPR, Al Jazeera, you name it. And some of you might actually recognize him from his famous TED Talk, Faith versus Tradition in Islam, that has been watched by more than 1.2 million viewers. With that, thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Akyol. We are honored to have you today with us.
Thank you so much, Rutaba and Mehlaka, for organizing this event. It's my honor, to join you and have this conversation with you and with our friends. Thanks for Asher also, who's been helpful, and others who are joining us today. We're going to speak about freedom of expression in the Muslim world today, of course. And I think I think we have problems. We have problems in terms of freedom of expression. But I think these come from certain understandings of religion or politics that we Muslims can change. And we can also look back to our history and we can say, actually, there was a time that we were much better than this. There was a time that we actually were the civilization which had the highest levels of freedom of speech or freedom of religion. And that was what made us great. Now, that's an argument I actually espouse in the book a little bit. So if you would like, should I begin with that, or you want to ask a question? Well,
I do want to ask the question,
okay.
actually. So actually wanted to ask you and start this session with your own experience. Something that I think you mentioned in your latest book, where you were invited to Malaysia to discuss your book, Islam Without Extremes. Could you actually shed light on your experience there and what that experience demonstrates about the space available for intellectual and theological discourses in the broader Muslim world? And you can dive straight into it, but I would actually also, because it's a timely subject, about the developments in Afghanistan, if you have a minute that you can spare to talk about your insights and your views of what's happening in Afghanistan, and then jump into the Malaysian incident, I think that would be very timely and important as well.
Yep. Thank you. Indeed, I mean, these are two different stories, what's happening in Afghanistan and what was the case in my personal experience in Malaysia 4 years ago. But they're somehow connected in the sense that we need a discussion all across the Muslim world, at least in many countries, on whether Islam should be based on freedom or coercion. What do I mean by coercion? The Taliban came to power in Afghanistan, right? There's a lot of geostrategics about it. I mean, the US was there, Taliban fought it. Now, I'm not going to discuss that today. When they came to power, for example, a few weeks, I've been reading the news, I mean, what they're saying. For example, they said, music is haram. Music, haram mean in Islam, religiously banned. Of course, that's not what all Muslims believe. That is what some Muslims believe. It's a very conservative position in the Sunni tradition. It has roots for sure. And I think it's partly because music was in the beginning maybe a pagan practice that some Muslims saw as alien. So there's a historical background to that. But whatever. Taliban says Taliban believes that music is Islamically haram. That is, as a good Muslim, you should not listen to music. Now, can we say to the Taliban, okay, then don't listen to it. Fine. But no. When they say haram, they mean the music will be banned in all Afghanistan, right? In all the emirate. So if you listen to music, you might be in trouble. They did this actually quite violently in the 90s. All cassettes were banned. Our young friends might not know what a cassette is, but it was old technology. I'm old enough to know that. It was like long string, which, it's a kind of a music format. Let's say CDs or MP3s or whatever of 20, 30 years ago. They had planned even like satellite dishes for sure, TVs, like whatever they thought is Islamically required was also imposed by force. Now, Taliban is a very extreme case of this, of course, but what they are doing there, which I call religious policing, also is practiced in various shades and grades in some other Muslim majority countries, like Saudi Arabia, like Iran. I mean, Iran, it's a big issue that Muslim women are forced to wear the hijab. And, there's a protest against that. Now, there's this idea that whatever you think Islamically is necessary, you have to make other people do it. And if they speak out against it, they criticize it, and you have to, punish them somehow. This, I believe, is a fundamental problem that we Muslims have to figure out. and because I think this idea of coercion in the name of religion, first of all, it leads to the imposition of one Islamic view on everybody else. I mean, Taliban believes music is haram. Okay, don't listen to it. But other Muslims don't think so. But Taliban imposes theirs on everybody as a through Islam. So every group that captures power in a territory, in Saudi Arabia, it is the Wahhabi tradition. In Iran, it's certainly the Shia, jurisprudence. Whatever group gets power in a given territory. That's why in a Sunni Islamic state, Shiites can be persecuted, whereas in a Shia Islamic state, Sunnis can be persecuted. I believe we should rather be, second, so it leads to this authoritarianism. Secondly, it leads to hypocrisy. I mean, if you force people to do something Islamically right by threats, those people are not really pious believers. They become hypocritical. Actually, in themselves, they are maybe reactionary against religion. It doesn't even help the piety, spirituality that we hope to be the base and the culmination of our faith. So this is a major problem. Now, Malaysia was an interesting experience, a little test with this coercive idea. I went to Malaysia several times, but the last visit was in 2017, September. I went there and I gave a public lecture on the issue of apostasy, Ridda, which is in connection to freedom of speech that we will highlight more today. And I said, Islam is a sincere faith. You cannot force it. You cannot coerce it. I made similar arguments. And I reminded a Quranic principle, La ikraha fid din, or there is no compulsion in religion. Probably every Muslim who is interested in, discussions about Islam knows this verse. And I said, because of this, since there is no compulsion, there should be no religious policing. And at the end of the conference, 5 serious men walked in and they said, you said there should be no religion police. Well, we are the religion police, they said. And they, asked me questions, interrogated me a little bit. They let me go that day, but the next day I was arrested and they interrogated me, they put me on trial. Luckily, I was let go thanks to some diplomacy. But what was interesting is that they were taking great pains to interpret the Quranic verse, La ikraha fid din, or there is no compulsion in religion, in a more limiting way. When they're translating it, they put a little parentheses into the verse. There is no compulsion in religion, only while entering Islam. The idea is that, we will not, if you're a Christian, we will not force you to become a Muslim. We might conquer your territory. That's another idea, but, and maybe it was more medieval. It doesn't happen anymore. But once you're Muslim, even by birth, you will be coerced. So there will be compulsion in religion. So this idea is what I'm mainly criticizing. And my feeling is that this is a residue of the interpretation of Islam in pre-modern imperial conditions. Islam was born in a world, Muslims lived in a world that actually Islam initially asked for freedom in Mecca. To you, your religion, and to me, mine. Islam was persecuted. Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his fellow Muslims, believers, fled, and they had to fight for survival. And when Prophet Muhammad passed away, Muslims were living in a violent world. Christians had empires, Byzantines, Sassanids had empires. So they built an empire, and that empire had its own drives. And sometimes it even interfered in the interpretation of Islamic law. So that's why you see doctrines like abrogation of the peaceful and tolerant verses of the Quran with the verses of war, which was a product of not Islam itself, not the Quran itself, but it was a product of the conditions of the time. And it's time for us to, I think, abandon these ideas because it is bringing a lot of problems to the Muslim world. And it is also stopping us from becoming more sophisticated, more learned, more nuanced, and better in our religious understandings. Now, one thing, after the religion police let me go in Malaysia, they banned my book, Islam Without Extremes. They said it's banned. It was translated in Malay. It was banned for more than 3 years. Luckily, about a year ago, the Islamic Renaissance Front in Malaysia went to the court, High Court, the Supreme Court, if I'm not wrong, or the High Court. That's the highest court in the country. They luckily ultimately set it free. So it can be read now, Islam Without Extremes. But in Malaysia, other books have been banned. Books about evolution, theory of evolution have been banned. And this brings us to the discussion about freedom of speech. Now, I understand that all these book banners in the Muslim world, from the Malaysian religious police, certainly Taliban with a lot of publications and TV and a lot of things, and Saudi Arabia, they think that if we ban these somehow wrong ideas, we will make Muslims better, right? We will keep our piety. What actually they are doing is that they are depriving Muslims from the challenge that they need to become more sophisticated. If you don't know what theory of evolution is, how are you going to respond it from a Muslim point of view? I mean, you can say we have theory of evolution in our point of view. We don't agree with the atheistic interpretation, but it's a scientific theory. Science is welcome from an Islamic point of view. So you can engage with it. You can make sense of it. But if you're scared of anything that is different than what you don't believe, you end up being less knowledgeable, less sophisticated, therefore less productive. And that's why the best universities in the world will not be in your in Pakistan or Malaysia, but it will be in free countries in the UK or US and so on and so forth. So I believe by the idea of constraining Muslim societies by force and coercion and limiting free speech, we are not serving our faith and our tradition and our society and our civilization.
That is interesting. You somehow managed to talk about your own personal experience and how there are certain semblances to what's happening in Afghanistan, all because, you know, we have this very restrictive understanding of what freedom stands for. And that brings me to the next question. Has the concept of freedom and freedom of expression in Islam always been this way, or has it evolved over time in Muslim communities?
Very good question. No, it has not always been this way. And that is, I think, a crucial point. Actually, if somebody could beam us back in time, if you had a time machine to take us back to, let's say, the 9th century, like 12 centuries ago, and when we look into the world and we said, which civilization has more freedom of speech and freedom of religion, we would say Islam has it. You know, Christians don't get it. You know, Christians are oppressive. Christians don't allow. I mean, Christendom at the time was more oppressive, and Islamic societies had more freedom of speech and religion. This is actually reflected in some interesting episodes that we should remind. I mean, we always, Muslims, take pride in the fact that early Islamic civilization had a golden age. Muslims were the ones who invented or developed mathematics and geometry and invented medicine, and then enlightened Europe later. And Europeans learned those things from us. Like algorithm comes from al-Khwarizmi, right? Or algebra comes from al-Jabir, you know, the Arabic word for mathematics. This is true, but how was that possible? Why Muslims were so creative and successful? It was because of freedom. And that you see this, for example, in the early Abbasid Caliphate, when Muslims, especially in Iraq, when they conquered civilizations and countries and cultures that had long traditions of science and philosophy and theology, Muslims started to interact with them and come to terms with them. They learned something called Greek philosophy. And they didn't burn the books or ban the books of Aristotle or Plato or Euclid. They translated them. Actually, that translation movement, as scientists, historians call, is one of the most interesting movements in world history. Before that, everybody read their own culture, but Muslims said, no, these Greeks, these infidels, from an Islamic point of view, they have wisdom, they know things, so we can translate and learn from them. That interaction initiated. It's not that Muslims learned everything from and repeated, and some people think that's that way. No, Muslims added to those things, sometimes corrected Greek misperceptions of religion, but that certainly was an intellectual trigger. Now today, if you publish a book of Aristotle under Taliban Afghanistan, I don't know what will happen. But 12 centuries ago, Muslims were the ones who translated and commented on. Some criticized it too, that's fine, but we had this kind of intellectual openness. One more thing, there again from 9th century Baghdad, there is an institution called Majlis al-Munazara, Salon of Debate. As we know from historians, these were discussions in the caliph's court. The caliph would invite, caliph like Caliph al-Ma'mun, would invite Christian theologians and Muslim ones, and they would tell to Christians, defend your religion. Say everything what you say. Even you can offend our religion. And Christians were a little bit scared in the beginning, but then they said what they said. And they said, there's no fear, defend your religion. And they had these intellectual discussions, which wouldn't be possible in oppressive societies at the time. In other words, I think it's fair to say this early Islamic civilization had more freedom than the Christendom of the time. And this is attested by historians like Bernard Lewis, I mean, who is critical of many things in the Islamic tradition, especially in the modern era. And that is true for religious freedom as well. When Christians were imposing just Christianity, even the Christianity of their sect, like Catholicism, Muslims allowed Christianity and Judaism to, live and flourish under Islamic rule. So what happened since then? On the one hand, we Muslims lost some of our pluralism, some of our freedom of speech and freedom of religion. We became more rigid. In the meantime, Europe and the broader West became more open and more tolerant and more diverse. And that is why today, I mean, people are today, some people are fleeing from Afghanistan, right? We see them on the news, sad stories. There are people fleeing from different parts of the Muslim world, and often where they go, they want to go to the West. So there's migration from the lens of Islam to the Western societies. 1,000 years ago, it was the exact opposite. People would escape Europe and come to the lens of Islam. People like who? Jews. Jews who were persecuted in Europe repeatedly fled to the Muslim world, which had more freedom. I think that's why we should think today, what is the lack of freedom that we have today? Why did we come to this point, and how we can go forward?
Well, that's very interesting. Clearly, freedom is a fluid idea, oscillates over time in history. And I'm sure Asher is going to ask you why freedom of expression declined, but I'm interested to know how marginalized communities like women and minorities have been accommodated under the ever-changing notion of freedom within Muslim societies, both historically as well as today.
Thank you. I mean, I mentioned minorities actually, just for example, until the modern era, basically until the 20th century, it's fair to say that the Jewish people had more freedom and tolerance in the Muslim world compared to Europe, but this changed dramatically in the past 120 years. Part of the problem is Arab-Israeli conflict. The other one is liberalism and human rights that flourished in Western societies, which gave Jews and other minorities. People forget that also Unitarians, these were Christians that they are still, but who didn't believe in Trinity, who believed in a one God like in Islam. They were heretics in early modern Europe, and some of them had to escape from Europe because they were being threatened to the Ottoman Empire. That's another minority, that escaped from less freedom to more freedom, which was in that case the Muslim world. Now, on women, again, you see a similar pattern. 1,000 years ago, if you look at the world, you would think that Muslims are giving too much rights to women. I mean, from the Christian point of view. Actually, we have people who said that. Like, Islamic law gives too much right to women. For example, right to own property. Islamic law gave women the right to own property since the very beginning. And Europeans didn't have that until the modern era. Actually, even when the British colonized Southeast Asia, the British law they brought with themselves deprived Muslim women from the right to own property. So there is a history there that we can say a long time ago, Muslim women were better off. Similarly, in the Ottoman Empire, we have cases of Christian women coming to Sharia courts instead of the Christian courts that they could go because they could think that they had more advantage in the Sharia courts. Now, a lot of Muslims remind this, and they're right. But those who remind us sometimes says, then we have no problem, right? Well, no, we have a problem. The problem is our standards of women's rights just froze. Even sometimes went down because of bigotry, patriarchy and all that. Whereas women's rights in the modern world just advanced dramatically. Like, for example, it was, and when you compare Islam to pre-modern non-Islam, pre-modern, let's say, Christian or Western world, you could say Islam gives women more rights. But if you compare it to the modern one, then there's a big shift there. For example, classical Islamic law gives women a share from inheritance. What is that share? Half of the man's share. If a father dies, he has a daughter and a son. Son gets twice the share in Islamic law. Now, this was legislated by the Quran, by the way. But if you look into the history and the context in which this legislation was enacted, you see that, it was a society where men were responsible by definition of women's well-being. Men were the breadwinners, and the alternative was not even considered. Whereas in the modern world, you have a very different situation. I mean, women are equal in many cases. Sometimes they have more burden. There are single mothers. There are people who live singles, and not necessarily men have that sort of responsibility. There's a social condition. So what was advanced for that society today, if you implement literally, blindly, in a literal sense, you will end up in problems. So therefore, today there are, I think, huge problems in terms of women's rights in many Muslim majority societies, sometimes by law, sometimes by culture and law together. And I think the key to going forward would be to understand why God enacted certain laws, or why Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, may have said certain things, and look into the intention and not the literal wording and literal implementation of those things. I can give you one more example, which is actually a timely topic. You are maybe familiar with the fact that Taliban has an obsession not allowing women to go out without a male guardian, right? Mahram. In the 90s, they were incredibly brutal about this. A woman could not leave her house and go to the market and supermarket and buy bread without a male guardian. They would flog women for this. So they were incredibly brutal. Now they're saying they will be nicer, and they're saying we will allow them to go to the market and walk in the city, but not a distance more than 50 miles, like not outside of the city. So they're a little bit milder, but still they're saying women cannot travel alone after a certain distance. Now, where does it come from? Well, it comes from hadiths, a few hadiths saying, attributed to Prophet Muhammad, where you hear the Prophet Muhammad saying, don't allow women go alone by themselves without a male guardian. But we should look why the Prophet might have said this. In 7th century Arabia, there were bandits in the desert. A woman walking alone from Mecca to Medina or on a camel back would be certainly prey to these people. Women didn't have weapons to protect themselves. So a male guardian was somebody who would protect a female from these very imminent dangers. But in a modern day society, travel isn't necessarily something like going in the Arabian desert in the midst of bandits. I mean, it means taking a flight or driving a car, and you don't have the same security concern. The security concern about driving a car will be fasten your seatbelts, right? So that will be, so we should understand why the Prophet was saying this. And for example, there are Turkish scholars, religious scholars from Diyanet. They make this interpretation. They said the Prophet might have said this, but there was a context, and it was about protection of women from danger. But if you're Taliban and if you don't want to understand why things were said, you want to be rather implementing them blindly, and also it serves your patriarchal culture, you run into these problems.
Thank you, Rutaba, and thank you, Mr. Akyol, for these very enlightened answers. And these answers actually generate the next questions. And since you're talking about evolution, then that there was more freedom of expression in the past times, like Christians are allowed to defend their religion. So I would like to ask that what factors led to the decline of freedom of expression and speech in the Muslim world, and what are the challenges and opportunities in promoting both these values in the Muslim majority countries?
Thank you so much, Ashir, for this question. What led to the decline? It's a huge question, but I can quickly summarize what I think. In the first formative centuries of Islam, there was not one true Islam that is necessarily imposed by the state as the official doctrine and remains like that for a very long period of time. Under the early Abbasid Caliphate, for example, in Iraq, you had the Mutazilites and the Hanbalis and the Asharites and the Hanafis and the Shia and certainly Christians and Jews and others as well. And these different Islamic groups and interpretations were competing with each other. There were tensions between them, but there was some plurality. And that plurality was forcing intellectual dynamism. They were writing rebuttals against each other, right? This is what they say, but this is what we say. So there were a lot of intellectual debates, criticizing the other side, defending their own doctrine. But gradually, a certain interpretation, a certain theology, a certain jurisprudence became the official view in the Sunni world. And Sunni world is like 90% of all Muslim world. The Asharite theology, Sunni jurisprudence, the four schools, and even those four schools, they had differences, but they were kind of minimized and brought to one consensus. Now, and people who think differently were branded as heretics and innovators. Innovators, not in a, they didn't mean innovation in a good sense, but in a bad sense, bidah, that's like a heresy. For example, philosophers, the people who studied Aristotle or Plato or Euclid, they were branded as heretics. It's a long history, you know. Al-Ghazali first condemned them for some excesses, but adopted some of their views. But people who came after Ghazali were even more rigid on this. So ultimately, philosophy, which is any idea outside of what you know as Islam, right, became a heretical notion. Now, you can see philosophy as heresy, but you can criticize it, right? But no, if you punish it and silence it, something else happens. Now, so in other words, the consolidation of a religious orthodoxy with the state, which my friend and colleague Ahmet Kuru calls the Ulema State Alliance, which took place after the 12th century, basically, was something that really suffocated free thinking. We actually hear about this from the great Muslim social scientist Ibn Khaldun. Ibn Khaldun was the greatest social scientist of the classical Islamic civilization from 14th century North Africa. And he was from Tunis and Egypt. He basically lived in North African landscape and examined, and he's a social scientist, so he was not a theologian. Here's a very interesting line. He says, now heretics and innovators have been destroyed. Logical arguments were, things have changed. Logical arguments were needed only when they were defended and supported their views with them. So heretics and innovators have been destroyed, and there's no more need for logical arguments against them. I mean, he doesn't say this as something that praises the situation, but as describes it. So the thing is, if you define a view as heresy and silence it, you will be left alone with your views, and nobody will disrupt your mind, and nobody will force you to ask questions. You'll not even need to be creative in your thought. And I think at the same time, those ideas of philosophy, Aristotelianism, entered Europe actually through Ibn Rushd, from our last great Aristotelian thinker. And it had a tectonic shift in Europe. And Catholics started to discuss this. Some condemn, some discuss this. And it started an intellectual view. Because here is my understanding. A lot of Muslims sometimes believe that God gave us as a guidance. What did God give us? God gave us revelation, the Quran and Sunnah. Actually, from the Quran, we can say God gave us revelation, but also human reason, human conscience. And with reason too, we can find moral truths. We cannot find everything. We cannot know how the heaven and hell will look like, or like metaphysics, but we can find moral truths, and we can find how the world works, how the world operates. But the disapproval of, the subduing of this independent reason that is philosophy, I think had a chilling effect, had a suffocating effect on Islamic thought. And that's what we still see, right? I mean, that's why Malaysian religious police, there's an institution called the religious police, and they ban books instead of, if you read a book and you don't like it, you criticize it. No, they don't criticize it, they ban it. And there's a history behind that.
Thank you so much. And since you are going, and you are, since last 2-3 questions, you are talking about, and you're giving examples of our great philosophers around the Muslim world, that they have corrected many things, and they have, in fact, many things have been exported from the Muslim world to the Western world, but still there are many who thinks that freedom of expression or freedom of speech other values associated with the Western Enlightenment and discussion of it within the Muslim society as an imposition. So how would you counter this charge?
Very good question. First of all, what is called the Western Enlightenment isn't just Western. In my book, Reopening Muslim Minds, I actually show that we Muslims had a contribution to it through Ibn Rushd, through Hay ibn Yaqzan, the philosophical novel that was the bestseller in 17th century Europe. So some of our Muslim ideas, including science, including Greek philosophy, including certain techniques of business and banking, had a big influence in European civilization. We should see that. Secondly, the problem here is, yes, Western Enlightenment took shape, but there was a problem with it, which was colonialism. And it came to us through, in many cases, through colonialism, and we rightly reacted to it. And we had all the right to react to it. However, this reaction has turned into such an obsession that you say any idea that has been uttered by the West, by somebody who's a Westerner, has to be rejected. It's a colonial project. We should not forget that the Enlightenment values in the West are the very things that also allowed a self-criticism in the West about their colonialism, right? If you go to any Western university today, colonialism, you'll see, is renounced as an evil thing. How did this happen, right? I mean, well, because the ideas like human rights, about pluralism, about respect became, and these are Enlightenment ideas. So, whereas, I mean, go to Russia, do they criticize Russian imperialism in their universities that much? I doubt. Or what about China? So we should see that the West had its own evolution, and the reaction, the rightful reaction to Western colonialism should not cloud our old judgment about certain ideas. Here's one thing. Democracy is a part of Western Enlightenment. Should we reject democracy? If you reject democracy, what do we have? We have autocratic Muslim rulers, despots. Is it a good thing that we reject the Western Enlightenment and we have despots? Wonderful. I mean, democracy is a good idea that worked in the West, and maybe, and we can find its roots or some inspirations for it, for democracy, which is what exactly Muslims have been doing since the 19th century, Islamic liberals in the Ottoman Empire. Oh, this sounds like Shura, the Quranic principle of consultation. So there are inspirations for democracy that we have found. I think we can do the same thing for other values. One more thing, Western Enlightenment, it's diverse, and there's a strain in France which was really anti-clerical, in other words, sometimes anti-religious, and I don't sympathize with that strain. But if you look at the Anglo-Saxon strain initiated by thinkers like John Locke, you see that the Western Enlightenment was a Western attempt to find a solution to religious violence and persecution in themselves. Like John Locke argued that the states should be neutral and only protect the rights of citizens, and states should not have official religious doctrines, because he, and like others in his era, was fed up with Christian theocracies brutalizing the heretics. Catholics and Protestants were slaughtering each other, and Locke said, let's just tolerate each other. So it is the same remedy that we need today. So if they found a remedy to their own problems and called it Western Enlightenment, we can find a remedy similarly about tolerance and freedom to our own issues, and we can call it the Eastern Enlightenment, which already has some roots in our tradition, as I argue in my book.
That's well explained. Well, I was just looking at the chat box, and somebody asked, okay, if Taliban says that music is haram, so is it their freedom of expression? We should consider it their freedom. So, like, I just wanted to connect this thing to my next question, which is, what are the limitations to freedom of expressions, and how do they differ in secular and Islamic conceptions?
Sure. I mean, can the Taliban say the music is haram? They can certainly say that. The problem is also they have AK-47s in their hands and they are enforcing it on people. I mean, anybody can believe music is haram or this or that is haram, and you have a right to practice that way Islam as the way you understand it. The problem is the imposition. to the question, what are the limits to freedom of expression? Well, this is a big debate, but I think Western liberal democracies generally have come to the good idea that incitement to violence cannot be allowed, right? I mean, if I go around and saying let's kill these people, right, that cannot be allowed because you're calling for violence, which has a direct impact on people. So, but besides that, if you're not calling for violence, criticizing a view, a group of people, a person, his beliefs, his convictions, that itself should not be a crime, in my view. It can be rude, it can be unwelcome, it can be unwise, and we can discuss about that, but that itself should not be a crime. Now, in Islam, first of all, we have some Muslims who say, well, you know what, offensive words should not be allowed, and we should always have respect against each other. That's fine. I'm in favor of respect. But don't forget that some of the things our Islamic traditions say will sound a little bit offensive. I mean, read the Quran and see what the Quran says about polytheism. The Quran says it's a delusion, right? These are false gods. Well, we can be nice to our polytheist neighbors, but those texts are there. Should we ban them because they're offensive, as some people, actually some far-right figures are saying in Europe? No. I think in every religious tradition, you have a proclamation of truth, and that will be not exactly what people believe in from the other side, and those things should coexist in society. Now, one issue here that is being very, of course, crucial is blasphemy. Like, what if some people come and say something really disrespectful, offensive, insult our religious values, our God, especially Prophet Muhammad? That's a very crucial issue. In Pakistan, I know it's a very, very crucial issue. Now, and a lot of Muslims will say blasphemy should not be allowed, and those people who say blasphemous words should be jailed and given harshest penalties. A small minority will even say, well, we should even punish them with our hands, right? Vigilante violence. A smaller minority will do this as terrorism in the middle of Europe, like attack the cartoons of news magazines like Charlie Hebdo. Now, here's what I think on this issue. I'm a Muslim, and I don't want to see my prophet being ridiculed or disrespected. I don't respect that, right? And I think that's wrong. Don't do that to my prophet, and I wouldn't do to your people. So that's a good moral, I think, stance. But what if people say things that are offensive? I mean, I think it's not, there's no wisdom in it, there's no virtue in being blasphemous, but what if they say that? Actually, the Quran says that you will hear offensive words from people given the book before you and from the polities. I mean, these things will happen no matter, not everybody is super nice and super sensitive in the world. These things will happen. The question is, yeah, we don't approve this. There's no virtue in that. There's no wisdom in that. But how do we respond, right? The idea that I think these things should be responded violently and oppressively, I don't find a basis for that in the Quran at all. Actually, the Prophet Muhammad has been offended in Mecca and later Medina. There are verses about that in the Quran, about how to respond to these offensive words. One of them, the most actually relevant one in the issue of mockery, which might be relevant to cartoons and things like that, is in the Surah Nisa, which is the 4th chapter of the Quran, verse 140. It says to Muslims, if you hear people denying and ridiculing God's revelation, if you hear people denying and ridiculing the Quran, people are sitting there making mockery of Quran, and what does it say? Do not sit with them unless they start to talk of other things. It doesn't say go and kill those people. It doesn't say go and jail those people. It says do not sit with those people, disapprove those people, disengage with them. This is the Quranic stance against blasphemy. There's no verse in the Quran which says go and violently punish people for blasphemy. And I think this can be the basis of our Muslim response. And I think it will cultivate more respect to our prophet, because when we go after people for illegitimately most of the time, defaming our prophet, I don't think we're cultivating any respect for Islam. There are some stories of prophet, a few individuals executed by early Muslims during the time of war in the Medinan period. But I go over them in my book, and I show them they were not just people who said offensive words. They were people who also actively attacked Muslims or provoked violence against Muslims by inciting a war. So that should be distinguished. There are cases of Prophet Muhammad being, peace be upon him, insulted, and he responds with grace and kindness. And through that, he wins some of those people, right? One of the fiercest enemy of early Islam was Umar ibn al-Khattab, who would become the greatest hero of Islam and the second caliph. He was an enemy. He was an Islamophobe. That term was actually used by recently for him by Sheikh Timothy Winter, Abdul Hakim and Murad. I mean, but if you respond with grace, sometimes you can win people. And I think that's the more mature Islamic thing to do.
Thank you so much. And with that, we are heading towards our concluding question, which I'll ask Rataba to do, and then we can proceed towards the Q&A sessions with our audience, and that will be moderated by Rataba. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ashraf.
So I'm going to take the moderator's privilege and ask you the first question while everyone else pulls in their question in the Q&A function. And this comes from us as a youth organization. We deal with young people. And so I genuinely want to know how you think young Muslims in Muslim majority countries should advance this idea of freedom in culturally and religiously palatable ways. What would your advice be?
First of all, I think we should defend and establish the conviction that nobody has a monopoly on truth, right? We all humans are fallible. We all humans have a certain perspective. We can be right and wrong. And none of us have the ultimate right answer for everything. And the Taliban doesn't have the right answers for everything as well. The Malaysian religion police, the Saudi authorities, the Iranian ones. And people say, oh, Islam is the truth. Well, of course, as we Muslims believe Islam is the truth, but even what Islam means has a million interpretations, right? So we should humbly follow our own convictions and try to convince others or just disagree with them respectfully, but we should not impose. And I think behind all this idea that we will bring the Islamic law and Islamic system and order, that beneath that, there is some arrogance. Like, we know what Islam is and we are educating you. In the meantime, we are coming to power thanks to that, right? So I think that sort of religious zealotry or authoritarianism is actually fueled by arrogance. I think we should defend that inside. Secondly, we should nurture a culture of debate and discussion and disagreement. I mean, I think it would be a great thing to, like in Oxford, they have this, or Cambridge, in UK universities, they have this public debates. This house defends this and this house defends that. Like, let's have more of that in Muslim societies, in our universities, in our colleges. Well, group A thinks this is the right way and group B thinks this is the wrong way. And some people disagree with all of them. So having in our educational systems too. I mean, I grew up in Turkey, and even in Turkey, like, the educational system is basically about educating you about the right doctrine, right? It's nationalism, It's never that, what do you think about this? And, students, let's bring the students, have a discussion about these things. So I think we should have more participatory discussions instead of just dictating the truth as we understand it to others, getting feedback and having disagreements and welcoming disagreements. Namık Kemal, a great Ottoman Muslim liberal thinker from the 19th century, he has this famous saying, Barikayı hakikat müsaademe-i efkardan doğar, which means the light of truth comes from the clash of ideas, right? The clash of ideas can show you something. With their clash, you can learn something. But if you have one idea and if you impose it on everybody, as they do in North Korea or China, and I'm afraid Taliban will do it in Afghanistan right now, you don't have much progress, you don't have much stability, you don't have much peace in that society.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Mustafa, for that, concluding that first section of our event. You gave us so much to think about already, and we have a list of wonderful audience questions. And so we're going to turn to that section of the event now. And our first question comes from Sabiha Rahman. You've possibly heard of her. She's an incredible author and writer. And her question is, what is the role of colonialism in regression of freedom of expression in Islam?
Well, first of all, thank you, and nice to hear from Sabiha, a friend and author who I respect indeed. His great publications on some of these issues we're speaking about. Well, colonialism has had two destructive effects, I think, in Muslim societies. On the one hand, itself was brutal, especially in Algeria, for example. The French came and brutalized Algeria 130 years, killed people, crushed rebellions, and in Southeast Asia as well. The Sepoy revolt is known as violently suppressed by the British. I mean, it's just that any invasion is destructive, and it in itself was terrible. It just destroyed human lives and human freedoms. Secondly, colonialism provoked a reaction which basically refuses everything that the world's liberal democracies are valuing, right? Oh, they're speaking something called freedom of speech. This is what we should deny because this is what the colonialists are saying. This is because it's a part of their colonialism. That was wrong, and I think that's the key issue here. Actually, I have a forthcoming book, Why, as a Muslim, I Defend Liberty, and I show that when the French colonized Egypt, some of the critics of the French colonial rule pointed to that they are violating freedom. They are violating actually people's right to travel safely. They are disallowing people to, have a meeting together, maybe to protest against France. So we should condemn colonialism from the perspective of human rights. You're teaching about human rights, you violated them, right? So it's human rights, human freedom is a basis to criticize colonialism. And let's not forget that we think of colonialism as only the Western intrusion in our part of the world. Russia has been, or the Soviet Union has been, a great colonial power. I mean, it just occupied Central Asia for decades. And it was more brutal most of the time because it was trying to eradicate religion in total. Central Asian countries, lived under Soviet despotism. And the Caucasus, I mean, my grandfather had to escape the Caucasus from the imperial conquest of the Russian Empire in 1860. So the world history is brutal. All powers did terrible things. We did conquest, military conquest from Spain to India. And we should be critical of all of those, but values are different, right? I mean, values of human rights and freedom and so on and so forth. I think one reaction of colonialism one consequence of colonialism has been to trigger a reactionary mood, which actually brings us today to some of the troublesome groups. I mean, we owe the Taliban partly to the Soviet occupation and then the US intervention, Taliban's return. So we should criticize and oppose foreign rule and foreign interventions, especially in colonial form. But also we should look into the world and we should see why those countries that we condemn as colonial are also the countries that today a lot of Muslims are living peacefully and happily and flourishing, because they have something called religious freedom, and that's a good thing.
That's really nice. We have a question from Iram Sajish. She asked that in Pakistan, a popular narrative is welcoming the Taliban. Now, given the recent developments, there are certain segments in Pakistan that have been welcoming the Taliban, though many of these people's life don't match with that of Taliban's narrative. Why do you think this phenomena is there?
The sympathy for Taliban?
Yes.
We have that in Turkey too. And actually in Turkey, the sympathizers of Taliban now, interestingly, includes the political party, which is the founder of Maoism in Turkey. I mean, these are Turkish communists, which have zero interest in Islam. They're atheists, the movement led by Doğu Perinçek, but they love Taliban now because Taliban defeated America, right? I mean, there's a kind of political drive there, which, I mean, I understand the dynamics behind it, but I think it's a misguided point of view. I mean, if you think the only problem in the world is America and anything that is anti-American is good, well, go try living in North Korea, right? It's a big anti-American power. It's nuclear. It is also powerful in that sense. It's the worst country in the world to live in. Try to be a Muslim in North Korea and see what they will do to you, right? China, I mean, China is an anti-Muslim, anti-American power. I mean, it's a rival power to America. Try being an Uyghur in the prisons of China, in the gulags, in the concentration camps. American foreign policy has lots to criticize in its foreign policy in the Middle East, from its take on Israel, Palestine, from its support for some of the useful dictators in the Middle East for many decades, you know, dictators that sold oil to America. But I think it's an obsession to think that this is the only problem in the world. If you don't think so, well, check the foreign policy of Russia and see what it did to Syria in the past 10 years. Check the foreign policy of Russia and see the Balkans, you know, see how Russia supported Serbian fascism that committed genocide against Bosnians, for example. So the world is a complicated place. Geostrategic is a big part of it. We have every right to criticize American foreign policy, as many Americans themselves are criticizing. But we should also, besides this thing, we should look into values, where you want to live in. America is also the country where every kind of Muslim I can imagine, from the Shiites to the Sunnis, all kinds of Sunnis, from the Ahmadis, can live happily and peacefully and flourishing without any oppression. So that's because they have religious freedom, and that's a good thing. So therefore, I mean, the people who I think sympathize with Taliban, just look into that geostrategic issue. I would advise them to see that, you know, what life will look like in Taliban, and question why so many people are escaping from Taliban rule right now, and many more probably will so in the future.
Thank you, Mustafa. So our next question is from Dr. Fahim Qazi, and he asks, is classical Islam compatible in the 21st century that we live in? And Mustafa, for those who don't know in our audience, could you just briefly describe what you mean by classical Islam?
Okay, did I use the term classical Islam? Apparently I did. People, okay. Well, I mean, you can say Islam is Islam, it's the Quran and Sunnah, so that's just textually. But by Islam, we also mean the Islamic civilization. So by classical Islam, I mean both the civilization and the religious interpretation within it that was there before the modern era, let's say before the 18th century. Now, are there aspects of classical Islam that today can inspire us and make us proud? Yes. Some of the things I mentioned. I mean, we were a more tolerant civilization. Christians and Jews flourished in Islamic world. Hindus and Buddhists later were also given the status people of the book. It was not equal, but for that time, it was a great actual status compared to forced conversions and violent persecutions. Classical Islam was the home to Beit al-Hikmah, the house of wisdom, you know, that, you know, brought these translations and global, the idea that culture is global and humanity's accomplishments should be shared. So many things. But also in classical Islam, I'll tell you something, there was slavery. There was concubinage. It was a part of the Sharia as Muslims understood through fiqh, through jurisprudence. In Istanbul, my country, my home city, there were slave markets. You know, you could go and buy a slave woman from Georgia or Africa, you know. So is this something I'm proud of? Not. And I'm glad that we were able to abolish slavery. And that happened when growingly more Muslims understood that, yes, in our jurisprudence, fiqh, there is slavery, but it is because when Islam came to the world, it was already there. So Islam legislated it and actually made it less oppressive, brought more compassion to it, gave some rights to slaves. But the ultimate goal, the right thing would be to abolish the institution, which luckily we did, but it wasn't easy. I'll tell you, when the idea that slavery as an institution should be abolished began in England. England began to promote this idea in the world. Americans resisted to some extent. That's why there was a big civil war, and there's an ugly history of slavery in the south of the United States. And in the Ottoman Empire, British calls for abolishing slavery was accepted to some extent when the Sultan Abdulmejid decided to ban slave trade. Not even abolish all slavery, but banning slave trade. And you know what happened? There was a revolt against the Ottoman Empire in Mecca by a cleric, Sharif Abdul Muttalib, who was a very strong conservative, strict conservative. And he said the Turks have become infidels because they're violating the Sharia, right? It's there. Slavery is there. In fiqh books, yes, it's there. So luckily, that idea gradually was defeated, but it wasn't easy. And today, when I look at some of the issues today, oh, if you defend freedom of speech, you're a kafir. Same thing, right? I mean, you're like as if defending something. What we should understand is that we have our religion that is eternal, that is divine, will be always honored, and it should guide us. But that religion was born into a history. And there are a lot of historical layers in what we call our religious tradition, from slavery to the idea that women should always obey their husbands, and husbands can do whatever they want to them. These are opinions of medieval jurists who lived in a culture of their time. Those opinions became sanctified as religion, but it's time to distinguish what is really truly religious and what is historical. And for that, we need freedom of speech so we can discuss these issues. We need philosophy so we can look into world history. We can have a broader scope of humanity, and we can go back and look into our religious jurisprudence.
Well, the next question is from Simon Silva. They ask, what would be the paths to reconcile faith with modern notions of freedom, equality, and human rights in nations that suffocate freedom in the name of their religious interpretation? Pretty heavy question.
In the name of their religious
interpretation.
Okay, like what kind of nations? I didn't fully understand the question.
Yeah, so they're basically asking, how do we reconcile faith? How do we make sure that faith is reconciled with modern notions of freedom, equality, and human rights, especially when nations use religious interpretations to quash on freedom, these freedoms?
Yeah. Well, you work on it, as I'm trying to do. You write books and give lectures, but I mean, here are some patterns, if you will, or here are some basic issues that needs to be figured out. One thing is there are certain doctrines in classical Islamic jurisprudence, Sunni jurisprudence, and Shia jurisprudence too, but there are nuances there. One is the abrogation of the Quran by abrogation of certain verses of the Quran by other verses. So many verses like La ikraha fi din, I read you that verse, there is no compulsion in religion. Some jurists said that, well, this verse was abrogated by the verse of the sword, fight the unbelievers, slay them, and wherever you siege, find them, or fight the people of the book until they are subdued. So there are verses in the Quran about war with the other, because Prophet Muhammad had to fight wars that he had to survive. I mean, because he was persecuted. So those wars were contextual, but what the medieval jurisprudence did was to take them as more definitive than the verses about toleration and pluralism and non-coercion. So that's one layer of interpretation which brought us a problem. The second layer is the hadith literature. Hadiths are sayings of Prophet Muhammad, but reported sayings and deeds of Prophet Muhammad. And I think every Muslim, including myself, would honor what the Prophet said and did. but we have only reports of those, which were first oral narrations, then were put into small scraps of paper, and ultimately they were canonized 2 centuries after the Prophet Muhammad. So the idea that apostates, for example, should be punished and killed comes from a hadith. And this hadith, did the Prophet really say this? Did some people misinterpret this? It was written 2 centuries after, right? There are several generations there, canonized 2 centuries after. So a more critical take on the hadith literature and using the Quran as basically the framework to look into the hadiths, rather than thinking that, you know, everything that is reported must be true. Everything that is considered sahih must be certainly true. Will be another layer of interpretation. And second, to understand that Islam was born in a context. I'll say that again. I mean, we have blasphemy laws, right? Yes, and look into the context of Islamic jurisprudence. Oh, when our jurists were saying blasphemy should be punished, the Byzantine Empire had very similar laws. The Sassanid Empire had very similar laws. It was such a world. The idea that you should have an empire and spread it through force, and you should have one official religion and impose it, at least make it supreme, that was the world that it was. So we need these conversations. And the thing is, in Turkey, we can have these conversations. In Malaysia, we can, but you have to be careful about the religious police. I'm afraid in Afghanistan now you won't have much room to have these conversations. So that's why freedom is important. And by freedom, I will value the freedom of Wahhabis and very critical, very conservative Sikhs to live and practice their religion. I'm just saying, well, I just should have the right to criticize you and differ from you. And the thing is, this has been already proposed by a lot of Muslim scholars since the 18th and 19th century. We have a whole scholarship called Islamic modernism. It began with Sayyid Ahmed Khan in India, Muhammad Abduh in Egypt, in the 20th century, Fazlur Rahman. Actually, what I'm doing is partly to bring some of their ideas, some of them are very academic ideas, to popular readership. And here is a legitimate way of understanding Islam in the modern era based on serious scholarship of Islam itself, which also recognizes that the Islamic tradition we have is partly manipulated by the powers that be that dominated Islam at that time.
Mustafa, we had a question that was sent in from Finland. I'm not sure if that attendee was actually able to, is actually participating right now, so I will just read it out. He said, Western societal values stress individual freedom over social conformity. Muslim societies strive for social conformity, that is social cohesion, and de-emphasize individual freedom. The question that arises here is, how is this expressed in the freedom of expression or lack of it in the Muslim world? Yes, so that was his question.
Thanks. I mean, the observation has certainly some truth to it. I'll just say Muslim societies are not that uniform too. We should not forget that. I mean, if you go to Bosnia and Herzegovina or Albania, these are Muslim majority societies, you will have Muslim cultures, Muslim majority cultures that are actually a bit more individualistic from the way you describe. They're more, let's say, closer to what's described as the European culture. So, and because, I mean, religion is not the only thing that defines a society, right? Even if things that are considered as religion might have a cultural background to it. Like in Turkey, we have a problem of patriarchy, husbands, angry husbands beating their wives, God forbid, killing them, and that sort of thing, terrible things happening. And is this coming from religion? Not necessarily. I mean, not much so. It comes because it happens amongst Turkish secular men too. It's just patriarchy. It's the idea that the men should dominate and the husband should listen. So the kind of cultural conformity that is being described, I see it as a part of that. And let's not forget that the Western societies were also asking for cultural conformity. Now, I'll just say one thing. The idea that cultural conformity creates a better piety is wrong, or at least it's not a must. Because what we call as conformity can also lead to hypocrisy. People might be behaving in certain ways, people might be wearing the hijab, people might be going to the mosque every Friday because that's what the society demands from them. And I don't see that as genuine piety, right? That is just going with the culture. Whereas you, in a society where people are more individualistic, you can actually be a better, more pious Muslim because you'll be doing things because you believe into it. Nobody forces you. Nobody really expects you to do those things, but you do it because you have the faith in Islam. And because your faith in Islam can have many different manifestations, you have the room to really be a Muslim in the way you believe it. So I think there's no ideal society on earth. I'm not going to tell you that the Western societies are wonderful and Eastern societies are not. That's wrong. And the Western individualism has some negative outcomes as well. People becoming alone and depressed. I mean, that sort of thing. We have more suicide probably in Western societies than in Muslim societies, for example. However, I think I see the value in individuality, and I believe Islam is itself not a communalistic religion as those people who defend the communalistic view understand. It's a great emphasis of the Quran that every individual is created by God, is given a moral compass by God, and will go to God in afterlife as an individual and will be judged by according to his or her deeds. So the idea that the individual should be the soul in the community, I don't even see it as Islamic. It can be just a communalistic culture, which would be also, if it was Islamic, if it was non-Islamic, it would have similar manifestations.
Right. Muhammad Muiz had a question for you. He wrote, the world is divided on the issue. If the person has the authority that they're right, then they feel like they should tell everyone that that is what you have to follow. For example, where is the freedom of speech when you speak in support of Palestine and Kashmir, then Twitter and Facebook warns you and suspend you for a day? So I think it's a good question to ask in terms of social media and how freedom of expression and speech are dealt with today.
I don't know what Facebook was doing really regarding Palestine or Kashmir, but I think you should have the right to defend Palestine or Kashmir or any cause, unless you're advocating an action that one can call terrorism, right? That should not be glorified. But other than that, defend the Palestinian cause. In Western society, people do defend the Palestinian cause. People will march with Palestinian flags. In America, there is some pressure, not legal, but kind of social pressure because of there's a very strong pro-Israeli lobby and it has its own kind of social power sometimes. And I think that can be suffocating. However, legally, you can say anything you want. I mean, for example, people generally sometimes point out, not in Western societies are not as free as they think. Holocaust denial is, for example, criminalized. Well, yes, in Germany, but not in the United States. People are Holocaust deniers, which I think is a terrible idea, and I think it's an expression of fascism. But every society has what they approve and disapprove in certain ways, and they might have their biases, right? When you say something, people say, oh, this is unacceptable. But the question is, are you prosecuted by that? Are you being targeted by that? Is the police at your door or not? So and I don't know what honestly Facebook is doing about that. If Facebook or other social media giants are acting unfair, unjust, unprincipled on this, we have all the room to criticize them based on the freedom of speech standards. I'll give you another example. Freedom is the very standard by which we can criticize Western governments or Western societies when they violate freedom. In France, there's a strong tendency to interfere in the way the Muslim women dress, right? There was a time, I mean, they banned hijab in high schools. There was a time that the French police was going after burkini on beaches. I call it secularism police, you know, a mirror image of Iran. There is a party now in France which says hijab should be banned even on the streets. Now, what is a principle against these people we will appeal to? It is freedom. It's individual freedom. And actually, there are grounds that the European Court of Human Rights would uphold this freedom if France really goes that far. But so we will say, do not interfere in women's dresses. It's their choice. Now, if this freedom value is a good thing, and if we need that in Western societies, and we should condemn them or criticize them when they violate this, but we need to establish the same value in Saudi Arabia or Iran as well. In other words, a woman should be able to whatever she wants, both in the streets of Paris and the streets of Tehran or Riyadh and Kabul, I think these days.
I actually have a question for you. And I mean, who should monitor freedom in Muslim societies, right? I mean, throughout the conversation you've talked about how freedom has been monitored by state institutions and in some parts by non-state actors. You know, even in Pakistan, for example, there are religious groups who continue to challenge states' authority, saying that they're not religious enough, and so they sort of become these vigilantes that you mentioned earlier in discussion. So can you shed light on this nexus between authority, particularly political authority, and freedom in societies, and who eventually should provide oversight, not control, but oversight to freedom in Muslim societies?
Well, the state, first of all, should be neutral towards citizens, and the state should protect the rights of citizens, whatever those citizens believe in, whatever religion or sect they believe in, or whether they don't believe in anything, right? And I think Pakistan had such a good founding in the beginning. There's this famous speech of Qaid-e-Azam Jinnah when he said in 1948, or if I'm not wrong, he said to the General Assembly, you're free to go to your temples, your mosques, even if you're Hindu, Muslim, it's not the business of the state. Now, that was the right ideal. I'm sad to see that Pakistan retreated back from that, you know, beginning from the 70s with the rise of political Islam, legal changes, and so on and so forth. So it's, first of all, the state should not buy into the militant groups or oppressive groups who says, this is what our religion requires and we should do this. And if you're not sure if it's a good idea or not, just cross the border and check India. Should the Indian state protect all citizens regardless of their beliefs? Yes, especially Muslims, because those Muslims are being threatened by Hindu supremacists, right? The Hindutva movement, which just like the Islamic supremacists, Muslim supremacists are trying to impose their value and see other citizens as, and I think it's a lesson that Indian Muslims are defending the liberal secular constitution of India in the past few years against Hindutva fanatics, which we should do, you know, in Pakistan against fanatics acting in the name of Islam. Then those groups which are, I mean, the state should be neutral in the first place. Then we should have a conversation with these groups like, who gives you the rights to define what right Islam is and impose it on other people? How do you, I mean, you can believe in your religious interpretation. Or they will say, oh, Prophet Muhammad established a state. Are you Prophet Muhammad? Like, Prophet Muhammad, of course, defined what the true Islam is. He was the one who brought it to us. After Prophet Muhammad, we are just left to our own devices. We have our texts, we have a Kunnah, we have some Hadith, we have Quran, and we have Sunnah and Hadiths. And we interpret them in the way we believe in, and there is no person who can say this is the right. So practice Islam in the way you believe in it. You can propagate that too. You can be a Tablighi Jamaat and, you know, share your beliefs with others. But if other Muslims say, thank you, but I'm not convinced that way, I'm doing my own thing, you have no right to harass them. You have no right to intimidate them. And if you do so, you are acting out of arrogance and not true godliness. So I think we should promote that culture. Turkey, my country, it has big political problems. these days in the past few years. But in terms of religion in public life, it's broadly in a good state right now. I mean, if you go to Turkey, you will see that probably half of all Turkish women wear hijab, the other half doesn't. It's fine. Everybody is free to do whatever they want. You go to Istanbul, you have the world's greatest mosques, and you have, I don't know, secular lifestyle, bars, clubs, whatever. And Turkish Muslims practice Islam in the way they believe. I mean, there's a Diyanet, which is official religious institution, which is criticized because it's funded by taxpayers. Yes, there are issues there, but by and large, it's not non-coercive, and I think it's a healthy religiosity. I think that should be a model. Bosnia-Herzegovina, even a better one, I think. I mean, we don't need religion to be really imposed by the state, monitored by these vigilante groups, and so on and so forth. We don't need militants on the street which will ban any disrespect to Prophet Muhammad. Prophet Muhammad doesn't need to be defended by these thugs, which generally actually do terrible things in his name and then only, I think, defame the beautiful name of Islam.
Thank you, Mustafa. So we have a question by Enos Yunus. I think the majority of Muslims would agree that you cannot legislate personal morality because morality is by definition a function of choice. However, this position has no official institutional representation in the Muslim world. Would you agree, or are there organized efforts being advanced by institutions in the West and or Muslim majority nations? If so, can you spotlight them?
I didn't fully understand the second part of the question. I mean, most Muslims will agree that morality should not be legislated, but what does it ask again?
But he's saying that there's no institutional representation of that position in the Muslim.
Of this view, yeah.
Yes, of this view. And would you agree, or are there organized efforts being advanced by institutions in the West and or Muslim majority nations?
Actually, there are. I mean, if you check Turkish Diyanet, and that is the institution, the religious directorate of religious affairs, and if you look at their teachings, you will see generally a non-coercive understanding of Islam, like how they understand hisba, how they understand commending the right and forbidding the wrong. That's taken as the basis of religious policing. I mean, I've been checking those writings on these issues. Generally, it's non-coercive. Because I mean, it doesn't make sense. I mean, you see this in a certain social setting, right? One thing, when I say like these things should not be coerced, right? I mean, if you listen to music, then don't. I mean, if you think music is haram, then don't listen to it. I get angry reactions sometimes on social media. Oh, this means if you don't believe, you should not murder people, but don't murder people. But if you believe it, murder them, or so on and so forth. These kind of reactions come, right? This comes from the inability to distinguish crime versus sin. Right? Certain things are crimes. Like our Sharia, Islamic Sharia, criminalizes theft, right? But theft would be criminalized by any legal system in the world because humanity recognizes as a crime. But it's not the same thing with other things that the Sharia bans, such as drinking wine or listening to music. If you ask to Taliban, I don't think it's banned, but certain things are about piety and practice and your obligations towards God. Other things are your obligations towards other human beings. So, of course, things like the banning of theft, murder, rape, aggression, these things should be banned, and they are banned in any civilized society in the world today. But the one problem is a confusion and a fusion of sin and crime, which I criticize in my books. And that has happened in classical Islam, to go back to that term, because some of our scholars use the Quranic notion of commending the right and forbidding the wrong, Amr bil Ma'ruf and Nahi anil Munkar, to think that everything that the Sharia bans should also be seen as a crime to be punished, at least when it is done publicly. Like, don't drink wine. And the interesting thing is, the Quran makes that distinction between sin and crime. the Quran criminalizes certain acts. Like according to Quran, theft and murder are crimes. According to Quran, eating pork or drinking wine are sins. So there are punishments for crimes, but there are no punishments for sins. God says, don't do these things, and you will answer to God in the afterlife. But Islamic jurisprudence gradually criminalized everything through qiyas, through analogy. They said, oh, so there's no punishment for drinking wine, so 40 lashes or 80 lashes, let's just also legislate as well. But this was a decision, right? This was a human decision. This was not really coming from religion, the undisputed sources of religion, which is the Quran and undisputed, let's say, Sunnah. So I think we should disentangle Islam from state power, and we should be able to make a distinction between sin and crime. Good, and the, of course, complication here is that everybody's definition of sin is different, right? According to Taliban, music is sin. According to Taliban of the 90s, not wearing a burqa was sin. Now they're saying we have become more tolerant, we will allow hijab, right? Well, a lot of Muslims will say not wearing a hijab is not a sin either because we don't understand it like that. Plus, even if we understand it that way, this is how much I can practice it. So there are millions of ways of understanding these texts. And we should respect fellow Muslims in their interpretations, let alone non-Muslims and other interpretations, other faith traditions, to live in peace and tolerance. And that's what, if there's something good about Western Enlightenment, that's all about it. And I think Muslims living in Western societies already see this, right? I mean, we're glad that, I mean, if you live in America, Mahlika, you know that, I mean, there might be some Islamophobes, those people are disturbing, but by law, you can be a Muslim, practice in the way you want it. You can go to your mosque, you can live your religion, and nobody's going to harass you for that. And your Sikh or Jewish or Christian neighbor will have the same rights with you. And I think there's some value in it that we can appreciate by reason and by moral intuition. And even from certain messages of the Quran, like La ikraha fid din, there's no compulsion in religion, which didn't get enough attention in our classical jurisprudence, as I show in my book, but I think it's time to revive them.
Well, we'll take the last question. And I think with that, because we're not just nearing the end, and I will come full circle because the last question by Nazifa, it actually talks about Taliban, and she's two parts of the question. So if you can just briefly maybe touch upon them and we can wrap the session. She says, if the Taliban continue to rule the way that they did in the 90s, what would the wider implications of that be on Islam and the worldview on Islam? And in the second part, she basically asks, considering the Taliban's draconian views of Islam, such as implementation of Hudud ordinance, women's rights, do you think that there is any hope stand can soften from the previous stance in the 90s?
So thank you. To get it better, is the question, will they change compared to the 90s? Will they be softer compared to the 90s or not? Is that the question? Okay.
Yeah, the second part is your view on whether they would be a bit softer, and if they are ruling the way they are, what would the implications be on Islam and the wider worldview of Islam?
Well, if there will be a bit softer than the 90s, that in itself will be good. I mean, it's better to be less brutal than more brutal. So fine, but still they will be brutal. Still they will be oppressive. I mean, first of all, they're not accepting democracy, right? So it's not like that. I don't like the leader of the Emir al-Mu'mineen of that Taliban will appoint. So can I vote for somebody else? No, that guy got power through arms, through power, so he will rule it. Will you be able to criticize the ruler? I don't think so. Probably not very vocally. Still, they will be imposing a lifestyle. They will not maybe impose the burqa, but they will certainly impose hijab. And that is a problem too. I mean, why are you imposing women to wear a certain dress code that you think is necessary for them? There's a whole movement in Iran against enforced hijab, and I think there will be things like that. So the fact that they are a little bit, and for example, Shiites, I mean, they were pretty brutal against the Hazara community. There are horrible episodes there. Now they seem to be a little bit more lenient. Fine, I'll welcome that. I'll take it. it's a progress towards the right direction, but still there's a huge direction to go forward. Now, the implications of this could be one bad implication could be some of the more hardline elements in the Taliban can find this too liberal and renounce the Taliban and join the more dark side, that is ISIS. And I think that has already happened to some extent, as I understand from some of the reports. That is one threat. Secondly, because it's a bit less brutal, Taliban may look like to a lot of the conservative Sunni circles around the world, yes, this is the ideal, perfect. So, I mean, there were a bit too much in the 90s, but this is the ideal Islamic rule, which I don't think is the case. So Taliban had already, gained that sort of reputation in the past few weeks. And again, I will welcome the change. I would prefer this compared to what was there, but this certainly is not an ideal society for Muslims. We need Muslim majority societies like Muhammad Ali Jinnah, Qaid Azam, said, it's not the business of your state what your faith is. The state respects you as a citizen, protects your rights, and it is your right to be a believer, a Muslim, a non-Muslim in the way you understand. And because there's no compulsion in religion.
That's a wonderful note to actually wrap this entire session on. I would like to thank you, Mustafa Akyol, for taking the time out of your busy schedule and just talking to us very openly about freedom and freedom of expression and speech in the Muslim world. On behalf of young people, of course, like you said, we're not a homogeneous group, so I can't speak on behalf of most young Muslims, but I can speak on behalf of the young Muslims that I worked with. We're happy to have these conversations because as growing up in the eye of the storm, where we're like stuck between the conservatives and the liberal, we don't really know where our place in the world is. To be able to have these conversations, to be able to reflect on our own habits, our own understanding of the world, because we sort of inherit these censorship subconsciously, and we don't really ask questions that challenge our own established ideas because we don't have that kind of critical thinking or the encouragement to think critically within our societies. So we have to push a little harder to be able to think. And it's nice to see people like yourself come out of the Muslim community and talk about these in indigenous ways, because we're also kind of tired of having Western narratives tell us about what freedom is. So it's nice to have our own people, in a way, talk to us and teach us about freedom of expression. So on behalf of the young people like National Model YC, and on behalf of Critical Connections, I want to thank you from the bottom of our heart, and I want to thank the audience for taking the time out. And with that, the session is formally ended. I hope everyone has a nice rest of the day and a good week. Thank you.
Thank you, Rutaba. I thank you and Mehlaka and Ashir and everybody who joined today and help us organize this from the bottom of my heart as well. I wish the best for Pakistan, Jiva Pakistan, I know that much, and Afghanistan as well, and all our Ummah, all our Muslim world. I mean, we have a great history. We have some problems today. We have to honestly speak about those problems so we can have a better future, inshallah. Right, as we say.
Inshallah. Thank you so much. Thank you all so much for joining us.
Thank you.